I'd always been the type of person who loved the outdoors, the solitude of nature, and the sense of peace that came with being away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. I was tired of the noise of the city, so I decided to go on a solo hike in the mountains. I had heard about an old abandoned mine up there, a place that had once been used by miners in the early 1900s. It was a bit of a legend among locals, shrouded in mystery, and I was curious to see it for myself. I set out early in the morning, with the sun still low in the sky, casting a soft orange glow over the trees. The trail was a bit rough, not well maintained, and not many people used it, which was exactly what I wanted. I packed my backpack with enough supplies for the day. Water, some granola bars, a flashlight just in case, and a map that looked like it had been drawn by someone who barely knew what they were doing. But it didn't matter. I had the whole day to myself, and I was excited. As I walked, the air grew cooler, the trees grew denser, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. The further I went, the more isolated I felt. There were no other hikers, no animals, not even a breeze to stir the leaves. It was as if the world had been swallowed up by the woods. Around noon, I reached a point where the path split. To the left was a narrow trail that seemed to climb up the mountain, and to the right a wider, more worn path that descended. According to the map, the mine was up the mountain. I figured it was time to start climbing, so I took the left path and started my ascent. The climb wasn't too difficult, but the air was thin up here, and I was soon sweating. The path was steep, and the trees grew closer together, their branches tangled above my head, blocking out the sun. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, with loose rocks and roots that seemed to appear out of nowhere, making every step more careful than the last. After what felt like hours, I finally saw a faint outline of a structure ahead. It was hidden behind a thick screen of trees and vines, barely visible at first. As I got closer, I realized it was the entrance to the mine. It looked exactly like the pictures I had seen, the old wooden beams, the rusted metal gate, and the surrounding debris that had once been a bustling mining site. I stood there for a moment, looking at it. The place looked abandoned, untouched by time. It was the kind of eerie quiet that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. There was no sound except the distant rustling of leaves in the wind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Still, I had come all this way, and my curiosity got the best of me. I walked up to the entrance and pushed the heavy wooden door open. It creaked loudly, and I winced at the sound. The mine smelled musty, like old wood, damp earth, and a hint of something chemical. The air inside was cool, almost cold, and I could see my breath as I took a step forward. The mine shaft stretched out in front of me, dark and narrow. I switched on my flashlight, and the beam cut through the gloom. The walls of the shaft were lined with old timber supports, some of them rotting away, while others looked surprisingly sturdy. It was clear that this mine hadn't seen any use in decades. There were piles of old equipment scattered around, rusted tools, and what looked like a long-abandoned cart on a set of tracks. As I ventured deeper into the mine, the air grew heavier. It felt oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in around me. The beam of my flashlight flickered, and I cursed under my breath, tapping it against my hand to make it work again. It blinked back to life, just in time, as I reached a fork in the tunnel. There were two passages to choose from, one that sloped downward, and another that appeared to lead further into the heart of the mountain. I stood there for a moment, considering my options. Both tunnels looked like they could lead to more of the same: darkness, dust, and decay. But something about the downward passage intrigued me. I had no idea why, but I felt drawn to it. I decided to go down the sloping tunnel. It was even colder here, and the air felt damp and thick. The ground was slippery, and I had to take slow, careful steps. As I descended deeper into the mine, the silence became almost unbearable. The only sound was the soft scuff of my boots on the ground and the occasional drip of water from somewhere deeper within the mountain. I rounded a corner and nearly tripped over something. Looking down, I saw a pile of rocks and broken timber. As I crouched down to examine it, I realized that the rocks weren't random. They were carefully placed, as if someone had intentionally stacked them there. My heart skipped a beat. Who else would be down here? I stood up quickly, my mind racing. There was no way anyone could have followed me into the mine without me noticing. I was alone. I had to be. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and I couldn't shake it. My instincts told me to turn around and leave, but my curiosity kept me moving forward. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the end of the tunnel. There, in the darkness, I could make out the faint outline of a large chamber. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The chamber was surprisingly large, with high ceilings and walls covered in old mining equipment. There were abandoned crates, scattered papers, and piles of what looked like old tools. But what caught my attention wasn't the debris. It was the strange markings on the walls. At first glance, they looked like nothing more than random scratches, but as I moved closer, I realized they were symbols, deep, deliberate carvings that seemed to tell a story. I ran my fingers along the carvings, tracing the intricate lines, but something about them made my skin crawl. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like they were alive, like they were watching me. My breath came faster, and I quickly pulled my hand away. That's when I heard it. A noise, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like someone whispering. It was coming from the far side of the chamber. My blood ran cold, and I froze in place, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I held my breath, straining to hear. The whispering grew louder, clearer, and it sounded like words, like a voice speaking in a language I didn't understand. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced. Was someone else here? But how? I hadn't seen anyone on the trail, and there had been no sign of anyone in the mine. It was just me, wasn't it? The whispering continued, but now it was mixed with another sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on wood. It was getting closer. I turned and bolted toward the tunnel, panic rising in my chest. My footsteps echoed off the walls, but I didn't dare slow down. The whispering grew louder, and the tapping sound grew faster, like something was chasing me. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know what was behind me. I reached the entrance of the mine and didn't stop running until I was back on the trail. I didn't stop to catch my breath or even look behind me. I just kept running, my lungs burning, my mind racing. What had I heard in there? What had I felt? By the time I reached my car, I was exhausted, covered in sweat, and shaking. I threw my gear into the back seat and slammed the door shut. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white. I looked out the window, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me. But there was nothing, just the empty wilderness. I started the car and drove away, the road winding through the mountains, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the mine, to the whispers, to the tapping. I didn't know what it was, and I didn't care to find out. I just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. And yet, as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been in that mine, it was still there, watching, waiting. For who? I didn't know, but I was never going back. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. I'd been working hard, and I needed some time away from the noise of everyday life. I found this small, remote campground nestled in the woods, far from any towns or cities. It looked perfect for some peace and quiet, with no distractions, just trees, a lake, and the calm sound of nature. I left early on a Friday morning. The drive was long but scenic, with winding roads lined by tall trees that created a canopy over the highway. The kind of scenery that made you forget all your worries. I had some music on and was feeling good, ready for a weekend of solitude. No one knew where I was going, and I liked it that way. Sometimes, it was nice to just get away from everyone. When I arrived, it was late in the afternoon. The campground was secluded, tucked away off a narrow dirt road, which made it even more appealing. There was a faded sign at the entrance that read "Campground Closed" in big, bold letters. But I figured it was just one of those signs left behind by the Park Service, and that it wasn't a big deal. I didn't see any other cars around, and that felt like a good sign to me. It meant I would have the place to myself. The air smelled fresh, earthy, and clean, and I could hear the distant chirping of birds. I parked my car by the old wooden fence that marked the campground's boundary and got out. The place was overgrown with weeds, and there was a noticeable quietness to it, almost too quiet. I didn't think much of it. I grabbed my backpack, set up a small tent near the edge of the lake, and started a campfire. The sound of the crackling wood was comforting, and I settled into my camp chair, feeling like I had all the time in the world. Nightfall came quickly. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the woods darkened around me. I was alone, just as I had hoped. The only sounds now were the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind, the crackling of the fire, and the soft splash of water against the shore. I sat back, enjoying the serenity, and thought about how nice it was to be away from everything. But as the night wore on, something strange began to happen. At first, it was small things. The campfire, for example, flickered wildly even though there was no wind. Then I thought I heard something, a faint noise in the distance. It sounded like footsteps. I quickly glanced around the campsite, but there was no one there. It was probably just a wild animal, or my imagination playing tricks on me. I shrugged it off and went back to enjoying the fire. But then the noises became more noticeable. Footsteps, crunching leaves and twigs, seemed to be coming from the edge of the woods. I stood up, heart pounding, and looked around. The trees were so thick I couldn't see much, but there was definitely something moving out there. "Hello," I called out, unsure of what I was expecting. No response. I waited for a moment, then laughed nervously at myself. It was probably a deer or some other animal. I'd been out in the woods enough to know that they made strange noises at night. But even though I tried to convince myself, the feeling of unease didn't go away. I sat back down by the fire, trying to ignore the unsettling sensation that crept over me. The noise stopped for a while, but then it started again, closer this time. The steps were slow and deliberate, not like an animal scurrying around. It sounded like someone walking through the woods, just out of sight. My heart began to race, and I stood up, straining my ears. I called out again, this time more loudly. "Who's there?" No answer. Nothing. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was as if the woods had swallowed up all sound, leaving me with nothing but the pounding of my own heartbeat. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and shone it toward the trees, but all I saw were shadows, stretching and shifting in the dim light of the campfire. I couldn't stand it anymore. I quickly grabbed my stuff, packed up my campfire, and began to get into my tent. But as I did, I heard something, a voice. It was faint at first, but it definitely came from the direction of the woods. "Help." It wasn't loud, but the word was clear. It was a whisper, almost a breathy plea, and it sent a chill up my spine. I froze, standing there in the dark, staring into the woods. It sounded like a woman's voice, distant but urgent. My first thought was that maybe someone had gotten lost, but then I realized how strange that was. I hadn't seen a single car on the road when I arrived. How could anyone be out here? "Help," the voice repeated, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and moved toward the sound, my legs trembling beneath me. The light beam flickered nervously as I walked toward the edge of the woods, every step crunching loudly underfoot. I called out, trying to sound calm, but my voice betrayed me. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The response was a soft laugh, almost too quiet to hear, but it sent a sharp sting of fear through me. It didn't sound human. It wasn't a friendly laugh. It was cold and hollow, like something that shouldn't have been there. I took a step back, my flashlight beam shaking in my hand. The trees ahead seemed to grow darker, as if the shadows were thickening around me. Something wasn't right. I turned around to head back to my tent, but as I did, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath caught in my throat. A figure was standing at the edge of the campfire's glow, just beyond the trees. It was too dark to make out any details, but I could see enough to know that it wasn't a person, at least not a normal one. The shape was tall and thin, with long, unnaturally long limbs that bent in strange ways. It stood motionless, watching me. Panic surged in me. I didn't know what it was or why it was there, but I knew I had to leave. I turned and ran back to my tent, feeling the cold breath of the night on my neck, and my heart pounded in my chest as if it were going to explode. I didn't look back. I scrambled into my tent, zipped it shut, and locked the flap. My hands shook as I tried to catch my breath. I could still hear the whispering, soft like a breeze. It came from all around me, but I couldn't tell where it was coming from. My mind raced, but all I could focus on was the image of that figure, standing just beyond the firelight. I had to get out of there. The night seemed to stretch on forever. I didn't sleep a wink. Every rustling sound, every creak of the trees, every shift in the wind sent my heart into a frenzy. I stayed in the tent, barely moving, not daring to peek out. Every few minutes, I heard that whisper again. "Help, help," and the strange laugh, too, growing closer and closer. I couldn't take it anymore. I waited until the first light of dawn broke through the trees, then packed up everything as quickly as I could. I didn't care about the mess I was leaving. I didn't care about the firewood or the camp stove. I just needed to leave. The whole drive back, I felt like something was following me. The woods were still quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, checking to see if anything was behind me, but nothing ever was. I never went back to that campground. It's been years, but every time I think about it, I feel the same cold shiver run down my spine. That place, that night, it wasn't just the fear of being alone. There was something else out there. Something in those woods, something that wasn't human, something that shouldn't have been there. And I know deep down that whatever it was, it's still out there waiting. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, just me, a small cabin, and the woods. I needed some time away from the chaos of life. Work had been stressful, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd had a moment to just breathe. So, I found this little cabin in the middle of nowhere, on a remote mountain trail, far away from anyone. I thought it would be perfect. Quiet, simple, and all mine. I left early one morning, the sun still low in the sky. The drive was long, and the roads were winding. As I left the city behind, the air began to feel fresher, crisper, and the trees seemed to grow taller, stretching toward the sky. There was something calming about the journey, and I could feel myself starting to relax. The cabin was located on a small dirt road, deep in the forest. As I drove closer, the trees grew denser, and the road became rougher. Eventually, I came to a stop, staring at the cabin. It was old but sturdy, with a stone chimney and a porch with a couple of rocking chairs. The place looked abandoned, but it didn't bother me. It was exactly what I had imagined. No one around, just nature and me. I parked my car, grabbed my backpack, and walked up the creaky steps to the front door. The key was hidden under the welcome mat, just like the owner had told me over the phone. I unlocked the door, pushed it open, and stepped inside. The inside was cozy but very old. Wooden beams supported the roof, and the furniture was simple: a couch, a small wooden table, a few chairs. There was a fireplace, which I was eager to use later in the evening. I dropped my bag on the floor and walked over to the window, which overlooked a small clearing surrounded by trees. It was beautiful, peaceful, and exactly what I had hoped for. The cabin seemed to be in decent condition. Dusty, but nothing that couldn't be cleaned up in a few minutes. I made myself at home, unpacking my things, lighting a fire in the fireplace, and setting up the kitchen. The warmth from the fire spread through the room, and I felt the weight of my stress beginning to melt away. It wasn't long before the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the forest. I decided to sit outside for a while, enjoying the last bit of daylight. The cool breeze rustled through the trees, and the sound of birds chirping slowly faded as the darkness settled in. I couldn't help but notice how quiet it was. Almost too quiet. No animals, no wind. Just silence. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, but it was strange. The kind of silence that makes you aware of every small noise, every movement. I brushed it off as just being unused to the isolation and went inside to make dinner. As I sat at the small table, eating my meal, I thought about how lucky I was to be here. No phone calls, no emails, no distractions. I could do whatever I wanted. I was free. But then, just as I was finishing my meal, I heard a noise, a soft thud, like something had fallen outside. My heart skipped a beat, and I immediately stood up, walking to the window to look out. There was nothing. The trees swayed gently, and the moonlight illuminated the clearing. I couldn't see anything unusual. Maybe a branch had fallen or an animal had brushed against the cabin. Still, the noise lingered in my mind. I shook it off, told myself it was nothing, and went back to my seat. I couldn't let something as small as that ruin the peace I had found. But as I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was a subtle feeling, just a nagging thought in the back of my mind. I tried to ignore it, but it wouldn't go away. I felt like there was something, or someone, out there in the woods, hiding just out of sight, waiting. The wind picked up, and the trees began to sway more violently. The fire crackled in the fireplace, but the sound of the wind outside seemed to drown it out. I could hear the leaves rustling, the branches creaking, the faint howl of the wind as it whipped through the trees. I sat in the chair, trying to read a book, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept wandering back to that feeling of being watched. I glanced toward the door, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. Just the dark night outside. Then, just as I was about to get up and check the locks on the windows, I heard it again, the sound of a thud. This time, it was louder, closer, and unmistakable. My heart raced. I stood up and walked cautiously toward the door, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I opened the door slowly, peering out into the dark. The wind was stronger now, and the trees were swaying wildly. There was nothing at first, just the empty clearing and the dark forest beyond it. I stepped out onto the porch, looking around. The shadows seemed to move in the corner of my vision, but every time I turned to face them, there was nothing. I stood there for a few moments, listening. The wind howled, but everything else was still. Too still. I walked back inside, locked the door behind me, and pulled the curtains shut. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, sent me into a state of heightened awareness. I stayed under the covers, eyes wide open, staring into the darkness, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. At least, not immediately. Around 3 a.m., I heard the noise again. This time, it was right outside the window. A tapping sound, faint but distinct, like someone was gently knocking on the glass. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, and I slowly slid out of bed. The room was dark, only lit by the faint glow of the moonlight coming through the curtains. I tiptoed to the window, heart in my throat, and pulled back the curtain just a little. There was nothing there. The clearing outside was empty. I felt foolish for getting worked up over something so small. It was probably just an animal, maybe a bird or a branch in the wind. But as I stood there, my eyes scanning the darkened trees, I noticed something odd. There was a shape, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the trees, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, thin, and unnaturally still. I gasped and backed away from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. I quickly turned off the light and sat back on the bed, holding my breath, trying not to make a sound. Minutes passed, maybe longer. My mind raced with thoughts of what I had seen. Had I imagined it? Was it just the shadows playing tricks on me? I didn't know, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, something, was out there waiting. The noise continued throughout the night. Soft thuds, like footsteps, coming from just beyond the cabin. Then the tapping again, always just out of sight, always when I least expected it. In the morning, I woke up feeling exhausted. I hadn't slept a wink, but I tried to tell myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I decided to leave that morning. There was no reason to stay. I packed my bags quickly, eager to get out of the cabin and back to the safety of the town. But when I opened the front door, I froze. There, on the steps, was a set of footprints, fresh ones, leading up to the door. They were big, muddy, and clearly visible in the morning light. There was no way they could have been there last night. I had locked the door and hadn't gone outside since. I didn't stick around to investigate. I grabbed my bag, ran to the car, and left as quickly as I could. The road back down the mountain felt endless, but as I finally reached the main road and the cabin was far behind me, I breathed a sigh of relief. Even now, when I think about that night, I can't shake the feeling that something, or someone was out there. I don't know who or what it was, but I never went back to that cabin. I couldn't. I don't know if it was the isolation that made me see things, or if something really was lurking in those woods. But I know one thing for sure. I'm never staying in an isolated cabin again. I had always been the type of person who enjoyed driving alone. The quiet, the open road, the hum of the engine, it was comforting. So, when I got the chance to take a road trip through the country, I jumped at it. It had been a long, stressful year at work, and I needed a break. A few days away from the city, just me and the road. I packed my car, grabbed a few snacks, and set off early one morning. The sun was just starting to rise, painting the sky with hues of pink and orange. I had planned a route that would take me through some scenic backroads, hoping to avoid the busy highways and experience some peace and quiet. The road was familiar enough. I'd driven it before. It was the perfect escape from the noise of the world. The drive was uneventful for the first few hours. The road twisted and turned through hills, forests, and small towns. The further I drove, the less civilization I saw. Eventually, the towns started to get smaller, and the road grew narrower. I wasn't worried. I had been down these roads before. I knew what to expect. After a while, I came to a stretch of road I hadn't remembered. It was long, straight, and empty, too empty. I glanced around, noticing that there were no signs of life. No cars, no houses, nothing. Just trees and the occasional animal darting across the road. The silence was almost unnerving. I had been used to the hum of traffic and the noise of towns, but here, it felt like I was driving through a ghost town. I shrugged it off. I had been on empty roads before, and it was nothing new. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe it was the isolation making me feel uneasy. Either way, I pushed forward. As the miles passed, I began to notice something strange. There were no mile markers, no signs telling me how far I had come or how much further I had to go. It was like the road went on forever, with no end in sight. The trees on either side of the road grew thicker, and the sunlight started to fade, despite it being midday. A heavy, thick fog began to settle, creeping in from the edges of the forest. I turned on the headlights, even though it was still light out. The fog was so dense it felt like I was driving through a dream. Everything seemed muffled, and the road ahead seemed endless, as if I was trapped in some loop. I couldn't see far beyond the hood of my car. The radio crackled faintly, playing nothing but static, and I couldn't get a signal on my phone. The further I drove, the more isolated I felt. At first, I thought it was just a temporary patch of fog. I had driven through foggy roads before, and it usually cleared up after a few minutes. But this felt different. It felt deliberate, like the fog wasn't going to let me leave. I kept driving, hoping to find some sign of life, some indication that I was still on the right track. But there was nothing. The road was empty, and the fog grew thicker by the minute. My mind began to race. Was I lost? How could I be lost on a road I knew so well? I checked my phone again, but there was still no signal. I pulled over, hoping to get my bearings, but as I stopped, I realized just how quiet it was. There were no sounds of birds, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of traffic. Just silence. I got out of the car, stretching my legs and looking around. The fog made everything seem surreal. The trees around me were thick and dark, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. There was something unsettling about it, something unnatural. I looked down the road, but all I could see was more fog, more emptiness. A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to shake it off. Get a grip, I told myself. It's just fog. It'll pass. I got back in the car, and as I was about to drive off, I noticed something strange on the side of the road. A figure, standing just beyond the trees, barely visible through the fog. My heart skipped a beat. I slammed on the brakes and stared at the figure, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was a person, or at least it looked like one. They stood motionless, almost as if they were waiting for something. The figure was too far away for me to see any details, but something about it felt wrong. It felt off. I waited for a few moments, my mind racing. Should I go closer? Should I call out? But the figure didn't move. They just stood there, staring at me, their form barely visible in the mist. I felt an overwhelming urge to leave, to get back on the road and drive away as fast as I could. I didn't know who that person was or what they were doing out here, but something told me I didn't want to find out. I hit the gas and sped away, my tires skidding slightly on the wet road as I accelerated. The fog closed in around me, and for a moment, I thought I saw the figure in my rearview mirror, standing at the edge of the road, still watching. My pulse raced, and I forced myself to focus on the road ahead. The fog seemed to get thicker the longer I drove. The car's headlights barely cut through it, and I couldn't see anything beyond the edge of the road. I kept my foot on the gas, trying to escape the oppressive feeling that had settled over me. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Then something strange happened. The road, which had been straight and narrow, began to curve, leading me through a small forest. I didn't remember any of this. I had driven this route many times, and there had never been a forest like this along the way. The trees were dense and twisted, their branches gnarled and unnatural. It felt like I had entered some kind of nightmare. The road twisted again, and suddenly, I saw something up ahead. A sign, but it wasn't like any sign I had seen before. The letters were faded, barely readable, and it was tilted at an odd angle. I slowed down and squinted, trying to make out the words. It was the name of the town I had been heading to, but something was wrong. The name was spelled wrong, and the town didn't look anything like what I remembered. I drove past it, my stomach turning in knots. What was happening? Where was I? I had to be on the right road. This was the only road to the town. But the fog was too thick, the surroundings too unfamiliar. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. I checked my phone again, but there was still no signal. No connection. No help. Just the thick fog pressing in on me from all sides. I had been driving for what felt like hours, but I hadn't seen a single sign of civilization. No other cars, no houses, no gas stations. Nothing. Just endless trees, twisting roads, and the oppressive silence that seemed to grow heavier with every passing minute. I came to another bend in the road and saw something that made my heart race. It was a car, parked in the middle of the road, facing the opposite direction. The engine was off, and there was no one in sight. The car was an old model, one I didn't recognize, and it looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Dust and dirt covered the windows, and the tires were half flat. I slowed down and pulled to the side of the road, my heart pounding. What was going on? Who would leave a car like that in the middle of nowhere? I stared at the car for a few moments, then glanced around. The fog seemed to have thickened even more, swallowing up the trees and the road. It felt like I was trapped in some sort of purgatory, unable to escape. I took a deep breath and drove past the car, my eyes locked on the rearview mirror. I half expected to see someone in the car, watching me, but the rearview mirror was empty. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a faint scratching sound, like nails on metal. I looked out the side window, but there was nothing. The sound continued, growing louder, closer, as if something was scraping against the car. I could feel my heart in my throat, and I slammed my foot on the gas, desperate to get away from whatever was behind me. The road seemed to stretch on forever, and the fog continued to close in. I could no longer tell if I was driving in a straight line or if I was just going around in circles. My hands were shaking, my mind racing. I had no idea where I was, and it felt like I had been driving for hours. But it was only when I looked out the front window again that I realized something truly terrifying. There, in the distance, was the sign again. The same faded, tilted sign that had greeted me earlier. I had come full circle. I wasn't sure what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't getting out of here. Hiking, backpacking, and exploring remote areas were my way of escaping the busy, stressful life I lived in the city. So when I heard about an old village that was tucked away in the mountains, forgotten by time, I knew I had to visit. The idea of walking through a place where people had lived once, but had long since moved on, filled me with excitement. It was exactly the kind of place I loved to discover. The village, from what I had heard, was isolated. It wasn't on any maps, and the only people who remembered it were old folks who had grown up there and moved away. According to some of the local hikers I spoke to, it was only a few miles off the main trail that ran through the mountains. The path to the village was said to be overgrown, making it hard to find. But I figured I could handle it. After all, I had done tougher hikes before. I packed a small backpack with essentials, water, snacks, a flashlight, a compass, and set off on a warm, sunny morning. The air was crisp, and the forest surrounding me was filled with the sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves. The excitement of what I might find kept me going, even though I had no clear idea of what to expect. It was just an old village, after all. The first few hours of the hike were easy. The main trail was clear, and I made good time. I passed through familiar areas, dense forests, babbling streams, and wide open meadows. But as I moved further from the main trail, things began to change. The ground grew steeper, and the forest became thicker. The trees were older, their trunks gnarled and covered in thick moss. The air smelled damp, and the quiet became more intense, as though the forest was holding its breath. At some point, I lost sight of the path. It had been faint to begin with, and now it was completely covered by tall grass and thick vines. I pulled out my compass and tried to navigate using the map I had made from the descriptions I'd gotten. I wasn't sure where I was anymore, but I knew the village had to be nearby. I pushed forward, cutting my way through the undergrowth with a small knife I had packed just for moments like this. Hours passed, and the sun began to dip lower in the sky. I had not seen a single other person. I was beginning to doubt if I was even on the right track. The dense trees around me made it hard to gauge where I was. The faint path I had followed was now completely gone. I started to wonder if I had made a mistake, but something kept pushing me to keep going. Then, just as I was about to sit down and take a break, I saw it, a small structure, half hidden by vines and moss. It was an old stone house, its roof collapsed in on itself, the walls covered in thick layers of ivy. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. I had found it, the forgotten village. At first, I wasn't sure if it was the village I had been searching for. The house looked abandoned for decades, but I had no way of knowing how old it really was. The door hung loosely on its hinges, and the windows were broken, their glass long gone. I stepped inside, carefully pushing the door open. Inside was dark and musty, the air thick with dust. The floor was cracked and uneven, and a few broken pieces of old furniture lay scattered around. I could feel the weight of history pressing in on me. This was a place that had once been filled with life, families, children, people going about their daily routines. Now it was nothing but a forgotten ruin. I walked through the house, running my fingers over the walls. There were remnants of old paintings, faded and torn. On the floor, I spotted an old book. Its pages were yellowed with age, and the cover had long since fallen apart. I picked it up and opened it, though the text was mostly illegible, faded by time and exposure to the elements. But there was something haunting about it. The idea that someone had once sat in this very house, reading those words. I left the house and continued exploring. The village was small, just a few more houses scattered through the trees. All of them were in a state of decay, some more than others. As I wandered through the area, I noticed that the houses seemed to be arranged in a circle, with a central open space in the middle. It looked like there had once been a gathering place, but now it was overgrown and forgotten. I sat down on a fallen log and took a break, sipping from my water bottle. The eerie silence of the place settled over me. It was unsettling, the way everything seemed so still. No animals moved through the trees, no birds sang. It was as if the entire village had been abandoned overnight, frozen in time. As I sat there, I began to feel something strange. A shiver ran down my spine. It wasn't just the cold evening air, it was a sense of being watched. I glanced around, but there was no one. The village was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stood up, trying to push the thought out of my mind, and walked toward the farthest house. It was the largest structure in the village, a stone building with a small chimney that had long since collapsed. The door was ajar, and I pushed it open, stepping inside. The inside of this house was in much better condition than the others. Though the floor was dusty and the air thick with neglect, there were no signs of severe decay. I walked through the rooms, noticing strange markings on the walls. At first, I thought they were just scratches or stains, but upon closer inspection, I realized they were symbols. They were carved into the wood and stone, crude yet deliberate. I couldn't make out the meaning of the symbols, but I felt a strange unease as I looked at them. It was as if they were calling to me, urging me to pay attention to something I couldn't understand. I shook my head, trying to push the thought out of my mind. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me. Still, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off about the place. I decided it was time to leave. The sun was setting, and I didn't want to be caught out here in the dark. I turned and made my way back to the center of the village, where I had left my backpack. But as I walked through the village, something caught my eye. A figure, standing in the distance, just beyond the edge of the trees. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. Was it a person? No, it couldn't be. I had seen no one all day, and I was sure there had been no one in the village. I squinted, trying to make out the figure, but the fog was rolling in quickly, making everything hazy. I took a step forward, then stopped. The figure didn't move. It was just standing there, watching me. My pulse quickened. The air felt thick with tension, and I felt an overwhelming urge to leave. But my legs felt heavy, as if I couldn't move. Then, the figure disappeared into the trees. I shook my head, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. Maybe it was just a trick of the fog or the shadows. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I had been in remote places before, and I had never felt this way. I grabbed my backpack and made my way back toward the path I had come from. The village felt wrong now, as if it wasn't meant to be found, as if it was hiding something. The more I walked, the more I felt that unease in my chest. The path back seemed longer than it had before, and the fog grew thicker, wrapping around me like a blanket. It wasn't until I reached the edge of the village, the place where the trees began to thin out and the path started again, that I allowed myself to breathe easier. But as I glanced back at the village, I saw something I couldn't explain. A light, a faint, flickering light in one of the windows of the largest house. I turned away quickly, telling myself it was just a trick of the light. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the village wasn't truly abandoned. Not really. Something was still there, something I couldn't understand, and I didn't want to find out. I had always been drawn to the idea of escaping the chaos of modern life. The constant buzz of social media, the never-ending messages and notifications, and the pressure of being on all the time, sometimes it felt suffocating. So, when I had the chance to go on a weekend trip to a cabin in the woods, I jumped at it. I needed a break. A real break. The kind where there's no Wi-Fi, no signals, just nature. I packed up my car on a cool Friday afternoon, leaving the city behind as I drove through the countryside, heading deeper into the forest. The drive was peaceful, and I could already feel my stress melting away. The road was winding and narrow, lined with tall trees that seemed to stretch toward the sky. The air smelled fresh, and the only sounds were the hum of the car engine and the occasional chirp of birds. The cabin I was renting was pretty isolated, tucked away in the middle of nowhere. I didn't mind that. In fact, the more isolated, the better. I wanted complete quiet, a place where I could truly unplug. My friends had warned me that the signal out there was weak, but that didn't bother me. I wasn't planning on checking my phone every few minutes anyway. I was looking forward to getting away from it all. When I arrived, the cabin looked just like the pictures, small, rustic, and surrounded by thick forest. It was exactly what I needed. I unpacked my bags, set my things inside, and decided to take a walk around the area before it got dark. The weather was perfect, with a cool breeze rustling the leaves of the trees. Everything felt peaceful and calm. But as I wandered deeper into the forest, something began to feel off. It wasn't anything specific, just a subtle shift in the air. The trees seemed denser, and the sounds of wildlife grew quieter. My mind tried to dismiss it, but I couldn't help feeling like I was being watched. I tried to shake the feeling off, telling myself I was just imagining things. After all, I was out in nature. It's normal for your senses to be heightened. I wandered back to the cabin just as the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. I was starting to feel the peace I'd been craving all day, but then I remembered something: my phone. I hadn't checked it in a few hours, and I wasn't used to being that disconnected. I pulled it out of my pocket to see if I had any messages. But when I looked at the screen, I noticed something strange. There was no signal. I wasn't entirely surprised. As I said, my friends had warned me about the spotty coverage, but it was still odd to see no bars at all. I stood there for a moment, staring at the screen. Maybe it was just a temporary glitch, I thought. I would check again later. Dinner was a simple affair, nothing fancy, just a microwave meal I'd brought with me. It wasn't much, but it was enough. As I ate, I glanced at the clock. The time seemed to move slowly out here. I couldn't hear anything except the occasional creak of the cabin and the distant sounds of the forest. My phone was still showing no signal, but I didn't mind. I didn't need the internet. I wasn't here for that. When I finished eating, I decided to sit outside on the porch with a book. The evening was cool, and I wrapped myself in a blanket, feeling the warmth from the cabin still lingering in the air. The quietness of the night was calming, but again, there was that feeling of being watched. I looked out into the woods, but all I saw were shadows. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. I laughed quietly to myself, shaking off the unease. The book I was reading was a good one, but after a while, I found myself staring at the dark woods, unable to focus on the pages. My phone sat next to me on the porch, its screen still blank, no signal. I hadn't realized how much I relied on it, even if I wasn't actively checking it. Just the knowledge that I couldn't use it made me feel a little restless. I decided to go to bed early. The bed in the cabin was comfortable enough, with soft blankets and a cozy pillow. I closed my eyes, trying to push the odd feelings from earlier out of my mind. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing strange noises, soft rustlings and whispers just beyond the window, like footsteps in the leaves or branches scraping against the walls. I told myself it was just animals, but it still unsettled me. Eventually, I fell asleep, but it wasn't peaceful. My dreams were filled with shadows moving in the woods, figures just out of sight, always watching. I woke up several times during the night, feeling the weight of the darkness pressing against the walls of the cabin. The phone, sitting on the nightstand beside me, still had no signal. The next morning, I woke up early, the sun just beginning to rise. The woods outside were quiet, and the cabin felt oddly still. I stretched and glanced at my phone again, but nothing had changed. I decided to go for a morning walk. The fresh air might help clear my mind, I thought. As I walked deeper into the forest, I couldn't help but notice how much it seemed to stretch on forever. There were no other cabins nearby, no signs of human life. I was completely alone out here. The air felt thicker than usual, and the quiet was almost suffocating. There was no breeze, no birds chirping, just an eerie silence. The trees stood tall and dense, blocking most of the sunlight. It was then that I realized something was off. The woods were too still, too quiet. I stopped and listened, straining my ears. There were no animal sounds, no rustling leaves, no chirping birds. Just silence. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. Maybe it was just the time of day, or maybe the forest was just in a strange mood today. I decided to turn back to the cabin. The walk wasn't as peaceful as I had hoped, and the strange feeling of being watched was creeping back into my thoughts. When I returned to the cabin, I tried to check my phone again. Still no signal. By now, it was starting to annoy me. I knew I had no reception out here, but it was strange for it to be completely dead. I couldn't even send a text or make a call. I wasn't sure why I even cared. After all, I didn't come here for the internet. But still, the dead phone in my hand made me feel disconnected from everything. I was isolated in a way I hadn't expected, and the quietness of the place only seemed to amplify it. That evening, as the sun set, I decided to try to relax. I lit a small fire in the cabin's fireplace, hoping the crackling flames would calm my nerves. I sat back in a chair, staring into the fire, my mind wandering. It was so quiet here. Too quiet. I glanced at my phone again, no signal. The phone felt like a weight in my hand now, a reminder of how disconnected I was. I decided to make some tea and call it a night early. But as I stepped into the kitchen, I heard something. A soft, faint sound. It was coming from outside, just beyond the cabin. I froze, listening. It was hard to make out, but it sounded like a voice. A whisper. My heart skipped a beat. I went to the window, peering out into the darkness. But I saw nothing. The woods were as still as they had been all day. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just the wind. The wind can play tricks on you in the woods, I thought. But still, the whispering voice lingered in my mind, making my skin crawl. I finished my tea quickly and went to bed, though sleep didn't come easy. My mind kept returning to the strange sound, the whisper I had heard in the woods. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just imagining things. But as I lay in bed, staring into the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly alone. I was driving alone, making my way down an empty stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere. It was late, and the sun had long since dipped below the horizon. I had been on the road for hours, and the only sound was the steady hum of the tires against the asphalt. My eyes were starting to feel heavy, and I knew I needed to stop for a break before I made any mistakes. That's when I saw the rest stop ahead. It was a small, dimly lit area off to the side of the highway, a sign pointing to it saying, "Rest area, open 24 hours." I didn't think much of it at first. A rest stop is a rest stop, right? A place to stretch my legs, maybe grab some coffee, and get back on the road. But as I pulled into the parking lot, something about the place didn't feel quite right. There were no other cars parked, which was strange for a rest stop on a highway, especially one that was open 24 hours. The lights flickered, casting an eerie glow on the surroundings, and there was a silence that seemed almost unnatural. I figured it was just my tiredness playing tricks on me. The building itself was old, with peeling paint on the walls and cracked windows. It looked like it hadn't been updated in years, maybe decades. There was a faded vending machine near the entrance, but it looked like it hadn't been restocked in a while. I got out of the car and walked toward the entrance, the gravel crunching beneath my feet. The air felt cold, even though it wasn't particularly chilly outside. As I pushed the door open, I immediately felt the weight of the stillness inside. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the room smelled faintly of mildew. The walls were lined with old, worn-out chairs, and a small desk sat in the corner with a sign that read, "Rest Area Attendant." But the desk was empty, and there was no sign of anyone around. I looked around, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. I stepped further inside, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The place felt deserted, almost abandoned, but I knew it wasn't. I couldn't shake the sensation that something was wrong. My mind told me to turn around, to get back in the car and leave, but my body didn't listen. I approached the vending machine, hoping to get something to drink. I could use a coffee, something to keep me awake for the rest of the drive. But as I got closer, I noticed the machine was not only out of order, but completely empty. I pressed a few buttons, half expecting it to give me something, anything, but nothing happened. That's when I heard it. A soft sound, coming from the hallway behind the vending machine. At first, it was so quiet that I thought I had imagined it, but then it came again. A faint, shuffling sound like footsteps. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I glanced around the room, but there was no one there. No one that I could see, anyway. I took a slow step back, my instincts screaming at me to leave, but something kept me rooted to the spot. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just around the corner. I stood still, barely breathing, my heart thumping in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Should I go see who or what was there? Or should I just leave and get back in my car, drive away as fast as I could? I took another step toward the hallway, but before I could turn the corner, I heard a voice. It was faint, but it was definitely there, coming from the dark hallway. "Help me." It was a whisper, so soft that I wasn't sure if I had actually heard it, or if it was just my imagination running wild. But the voice was clear enough that it made my skin crawl. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. I rounded the corner cautiously, my eyes scanning the hallway. The hallway was narrow, dimly lit by flickering lights. It stretched out before me, ending in a door that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. The air was colder here, and the silence was deafening. The footsteps were gone, replaced by that same soft voice that whispered again. "Help me." This time, the voice sounded closer. My pulse quickened, and I felt my throat tighten. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew I shouldn't be here. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. I turned to leave, but as I took a step back toward the door, I heard something that made me stop in my tracks. A low, hollow laugh echoed from the darkness. It wasn't a friendly laugh, nor was it a laugh that sounded human. It sent a chill down my spine. I didn't want to look, didn't want to investigate any further, but something in my body compelled me to turn around. My eyes scanned the hallway, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever, and I could feel my legs trembling. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the hallway. As I reached the door, I glanced over my shoulder one last time, and that's when I saw it. A figure, barely visible in the dark, standing at the far end of the hallway. It was just a shadow, no distinct features, but I could feel its presence. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me, watching me. I could feel my stomach drop. I turned quickly and ran toward the door, my heart racing in my chest. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the empty room as I pushed open the door and stumbled outside. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I rushed to my car, heart still pounding in my chest, and locked the doors as soon as I was inside. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, and I sped away from the rest stop, my eyes constantly glancing in the rearview mirror. But there was nothing behind me. Nothing except the dark highway stretching out into the night. I didn't know what I had seen or heard in that rest stop, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back there again. For the rest of the drive, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every time I glanced at my rearview mirror, I half expected to see a figure in the distance, watching me. But there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of highway, lit only by my headlights. When I finally arrived at my destination hours later, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I tried to brush it off as my imagination running wild, but something told me that what I had experienced wasn't just in my head. The rest stop had felt wrong. The air had been too still, the silence too heavy, and the voice too clear. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I wasn't the only one who had ever stopped at that rest stop. Whoever, or whatever, was still lingering, waiting for someone else to wander into its grip. As I lay in bed that night, I could still hear the voice in my mind. "Help me." And I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, in the dark, waiting for the next traveler to come along. It was one of those rare weekends when I found myself with a couple of free days, no work, no plans. It had been weeks since I'd gone anywhere, so I decided to take a quick trip into the woods for a short hike. It wasn't far from where I lived, just a small forest trail that I knew well. I had walked those trails dozens of times, and I loved how quiet and peaceful it was. No one ever went there, and that's exactly why I liked it. The air was crisp with the scent of pine trees and fresh earth. It was late afternoon, just before sunset, and the sunlight slanted through the branches in soft golden beams. I packed a small bag with some water, snacks, and my phone, just in case. I hadn't planned on being gone for long, just a quick escape into the solitude of nature. I parked my car by the usual entrance to the trailhead and made my way up the familiar dirt path. It was still a popular route, though not nearly as busy as other trails further into the park. Most people stopped at the main overlook a half-mile in, took a few photos, and then left. I preferred to go a little further, where the trail began to fade into the quiet, unmarked parts of the woods. I had walked this trail for years, but today something felt different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was an odd stillness in the air, like the woods were holding their breath. The usual chirps of birds and rustling of leaves were absent. Even the wind was unusually quiet. I chalked it up to my imagination. Maybe I was just feeling a little too restless or tired. As I walked, I let my mind wander. The sound of my boots crunching on the gravel was the only noise around. I passed the point where most people turned back, and the trail began to feel even more remote. I knew there were side paths off this main trail that led deeper into the woods, but I had never taken them. They always looked overgrown and unused, like no one else had bothered with them in years. Today, though, I felt strangely drawn to one of them. I had always ignored these paths before, but this time, something pushed me forward. I stood for a moment at the fork, looking down the overgrown trail. It was narrow, barely visible through the thick brush. It seemed like the forest had almost reclaimed it, but there was something about it that piqued my curiosity. Without thinking, I decided to take it. The path was rough, tangled with vines and low branches. I had to duck and step carefully over fallen logs and rocks. The air grew colder as I ventured deeper, the sunlight thinning between the trees. The further I walked, the quieter it became. The silence was almost oppressive now, and the forest seemed to close in around me. It felt like I was walking in a place that hadn't been disturbed in a long time. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath and looked around. The trees here were older, thicker, their gnarled branches reaching out like twisted hands. The ground was soft and uneven, with patches of moss covering the rocks and dirt. It was beautiful in its own way, but there was an unsettling feeling creeping up my spine. I turned around to see how far I had come, but the trail I had followed seemed to have disappeared behind me, swallowed by the thickening woods. I hesitated. It was hard to see where the path continued. There were no markers, no signs, just the occasional break in the brush that hinted at the way forward. I could turn back now, retrace my steps, and pretend none of this had happened. But something made me push forward. As I walked deeper into the woods, the trees grew closer together, blocking out more and more of the light. The air felt heavier now, and I had to strain to hear anything. But all I could hear was the steady rhythm of my breathing and the faint crunch of leaves underfoot. A part of me felt like I was being watched, but when I turned around, the path was still empty behind me. After what felt like hours, I came to a small clearing. It was strange. There was no real reason for the clearing to be here. It wasn't much of an open space, but enough for the trees to be spaced far apart, allowing the sunlight to filter through. In the center of the clearing stood something unexpected, a stone well, half covered in ivy and moss. I had never seen this well before, nor had I heard of any being in this area. I approached it cautiously, intrigued and a little uneasy. The well was old, much older than anything I had seen around here. The stone was weathered, covered in patches of green from the moisture of the forest. A thick layer of vines wrapped around the base, but I could see that the opening of the well was clear. The stone lid, which would have once covered it, had long since been removed, leaving the well open to the air. I leaned over the edge, peering down into the darkness. I couldn't see the bottom, just the cold, still water reflecting the little bit of light that filtered down. It was eerie, silent, as if the well had been untouched for a long time. I felt an odd pull to it, as though it were beckoning me, but I quickly stepped back, a shiver running down my spine. I wasn't sure why, but I felt like something in the woods didn't want me to stay there. I could almost sense the weight of the silence pressing down on me. It was too quiet now, and I knew I should leave. I turned away from the well and started back toward the path, but that's when I heard it. A faint sound, coming from somewhere ahead, though I couldn't see anything through the trees. It was a soft, rustling noise like something, or someone, was moving through the underbrush. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. I glanced around, but the woods were still. There was no movement, no sign of anyone. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a squirrel, but my mind wasn't convinced. It felt wrong, too deliberate, as if something was watching me. I took a deep breath and began walking faster, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. I pushed through the thick trees, the underbrush scratching at my legs as I made my way back to the main trail. But no matter how fast I walked, the sounds of rustling seemed to follow me, just out of sight. The sunlight was fading quickly now, the forest growing darker around me. I needed to get out of here. I kept my pace quick, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to turn around, to look behind me, but I couldn't bring myself to. The sound of movement grew closer, but when I turned, there was nothing there. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the familiar, wider path of the main trail. The trees were less dense here, and the sounds of the forest returned to normal, birds calling, the wind rustling through the branches. The weight lifted from my shoulders, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, something I had missed. I hurried back to my car, not daring to look back. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something standing in the trees, watching me leave. But there was nothing. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that the path I had taken wasn't meant to be found. Those strange sounds, it was as though the forest itself didn't want me there, as if it were protecting something deep in the woods, something forgotten, something buried. I didn't go back to that trail again. I couldn't. It was a quiet evening in late autumn when I found myself driving along the old highway, miles away from the nearest town. The sun had already set, leaving only the faintest glow along the horizon. The headlights of my car sliced through the dark, casting shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. I had been on the road for hours, the only sounds in the car being the hum of the tires on the asphalt and the occasional rattle of a loose part in the engine. It wasn't a road I traveled often. It was one of those remote highways, far from any cities or large towns, cutting through stretches of forest and empty fields. It was peaceful, but it had an eerie, almost lonely quality to it. I wasn't in a rush. The plan was to drive out of town for a couple of days, clear my head. Work had been stressful lately, and I needed some time alone. I had no destination in mind, just a general direction. But as the miles passed, I realized that I hadn't seen another car for nearly an hour. It wasn't uncommon for this stretch of road to be empty, but the isolation felt strange, even for here. I glanced at the fuel gauge. It was nearing the halfway mark. I had seen a small sign for a gas station about 10 miles back, but I hadn't paid much attention to it. The car had a decent range left. But as the night deepened and the road stretched ahead without any sign of civilization, I began to regret not stopping sooner. Maybe there's another station up ahead, I muttered to myself, glancing at the empty road again. The only things visible now were the occasional flicker of distant stars and the silhouette of trees that lined the highway like silent sentinels. A few more miles passed, and I started to grow uneasy. The gas gauge had dropped lower than I expected. The red warning light flickered briefly, then stayed on. I pulled over to the side of the road, putting the car in park. I sat in the silence for a moment, my breath misting in the cool night air. The moon was only half full, casting weak shadows that seemed to stretch across the road. I didn't want to risk running out of gas, but there were no other signs of any stations up ahead. No towns, no houses. Just endless trees and a road that seemed to go on forever. I checked my phone, but the signal was non-existent. Of course, it had to be this remote stretch of road that didn't have coverage. I cursed under my breath and looked around, wondering if I could walk back to that last station I'd passed. But something told me not to. It wasn't that I was afraid of being out there. It wasn't even the darkness or the isolation. It was more like a strange pull, a gut feeling that told me something was wrong. The air felt thick, heavy with anticipation, and I had a sudden, unshakable sense of unease. And then, as if to answer my unspoken worry, I saw it. Up ahead, in the distance, there was a faint glow of light. At first, I thought it was just another set of headlights, but then I realized the light was too steady, too constant. It wasn't moving. I squinted through the windshield, trying to make out the source of the light. It was coming from a building, or at least, that's what it looked like. I couldn't make out any details at this distance, but there was a faint outline of a structure against the dark backdrop of trees. A gas station. I felt a wave of relief. I wasn't sure how far I had come, or if it was the station I had passed earlier, but I knew I needed to get there. I started the car and pulled back onto the road, keeping my eyes on the distant light. The more I drove toward it, the more it seemed to appear out of nowhere, rising from the empty landscape. It was a small building with a single pump out front, but it looked old, almost abandoned. As I got closer, I realized there was something strange about it. There was no sign out front, no visible logo or name, just the faint glow of a dim light. And the more I looked at the gas station, the more wrong it felt. The air seemed to grow colder, and the quiet grew deeper, if that was even possible. It was as though the station wasn't a place that was meant to be found. I slowed down as I approached the station. The light was flickering, almost as if it was struggling to stay on. The gas pumps were old and rusty, the kind that hadn't been used in years. The building itself was small, made of wooden panels that had started to decay. It looked as though it had been here for decades, forgotten by time and the world. I pulled into the gravel parking area, the crunching of the tires on the stones echoing in the stillness. As I stepped out of the car, I felt an odd chill in the air. The station was dead silent. Not a single sound, no hum of lights, no distant rustling of trees, just a deep, unnatural stillness that wrapped around me. I walked over to the nearest pump and checked the price, but the numbers were faded and unreadable. The air around me seemed colder, and I pulled my jacket tighter around myself. The flickering light above the pump cast strange, elongated shadows that danced on the cracked pavement. I felt my heart rate pick up, and my fingers started to tingle from the cold. I didn't need gas, not yet, but I felt an odd pull to the building. Something about it called to me, almost like it was asking me to come inside. Against my better judgment, I made my way toward the entrance of the station. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the stillness. Inside, there was a counter and a few dusty shelves, but it was empty, no clerk, no signs of life. The interior was dimly lit by an overhead light that buzzed and flickered sporadically. The place had a stale, musty smell, like it hadn't been used in years. I looked around, wondering why the station was still open, despite its condition. There were no cars in the parking lot. No sign of anyone. I walked up to the counter and reached for the register. But then I stopped. There, behind the counter, was a small framed photo. It was old and faded, but I could still make out the image. It was a picture of the gas station, taken years ago, when it had been in better shape. But there was something odd about the people in the photo. They looked strange, too still, too perfect, like they were posing for something more than just a picture. I leaned in closer to get a better look, and that's when I felt it. The temperature in the room dropped, and I could see my breath in front of me. A soft whispering, almost like a low murmur, seemed to come from nowhere. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. The room was still. I shook my head, trying to clear the strange feeling creeping up my spine. Maybe it was the isolation, the hours of driving in the dark, but I was starting to feel like I wasn't alone. That's when I heard the footsteps. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. But as the sound grew louder, I turned to see a figure standing in the doorway. A man dressed in a faded uniform, his face obscured by a shadow. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice deep and almost raspy. I froze, unable to speak. The man didn't move, just stood there, watching me. His eyes were hollow, empty. "No," I said, shaking my head. "I'm just passing through." He didn't respond, just stood there silently. And then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he turned and walked back into the darkness outside, his footsteps fading as he disappeared into the night. I stood there, rooted to the spot, unsure of what to do next. The man had disappeared without a trace, and I was left alone in the gas station, with only the low hum of the light above and the eerie silence of the place. I knew I needed to leave. The unease in my chest had turned into something heavier, something that pressed on me from all sides. I turned and made my way back to my car, glancing over my shoulder one last time. The gas station was still there, standing in the middle of nowhere. I didn't know who the man was or why the station was still open, but I didn't care. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove off, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, and I never spoke about the station to anyone. Sometimes, when I drive by that stretch of road, I wonder if it was all just a strange hallucination or if the station is still there, waiting for the next traveler to wander in. But I'm not going back to find out.